You've heard the headlines: 6 wives, a split with Rome, a king who treated marriage vows like disposable paperwork. But what if the real story of Henry VIII is a map of grudges, carefully kept, obsessively nursed, and often paid in ruined lives? Who did he hate enough to erase from favour, fortune, or history itself? And why did some people survive his anger while others disappeared the moment his smile cooled? Tonight we're ranking 25 people Henry VIII seemed to loathe the most, based on what he did, what he wrote, and what official records later confirmed. Not gossip, not memes, the receipts of power, imprisonments, executions, forced exiles, public humiliations, and those icy courtroom victories that were really personal vendettas. If you like long, meticulous history, you can drift to, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Let's walk through the court of a man who never forgot a slight, and rarely forgave one. How this ranking works. Hatred is a slippery thing to measure, especially when the person doing the hating is also the state. So this list ranks hate the only way Henry's world really recorded it. Consequences. How hard did he come for them? How long did he pursue them? Did he merely ice them out, or did he turn the legal machine into a personal weapon? Did he keep pushing even after they were gone? Going after families, reputations, titles, even graves? Some of these people were once his favourites. That's part of the story. With Henry, love and hate didn't sit on opposite ends of a spectrum. They sat on the same lever, and when it flipped fast. Rank 25. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. For most of the 1510s, Thomas Wolsey wasn't just Henry's chief minister. He was the king's administrative spine. He negotiated treaties, raised money, staged the kind of glittering diplomacy that made England look bigger than it was. Contemporary accounts describe a man who could outwork entire councils and still find time to build palaces that screamed, quietly and expensively, "I run this place." Then came the one job Henry cared about more than governance, ending his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Wolsey tried. He worked the papal angles, pressed legal arguments, pulled diplomatic strings, but by 1529 the king's great matter was stuck, and Henry's patience turned into something colder. The pivot wasn't subtle. Wolsey was accused of acting under papal authority, essentially a legal excuse to destroy him without admitting the real reason was failure and embarrassment. Official records show his fall was swift, stripped of office, property seized, public status inverted. He died in 1530 on the way south, facing charges that could easily have ended in execution. If Henry truly hated Wolsey, it was a special Tudor kind of hate. Less, "I can't stand you," more, "You failed me, so you must become a warning." And speaking of warnings, the next name shows what happens when Henry decides the warning needs to be public. Rank 24. Elizabeth Barton, the Nun of Kent. Elizabeth Barton began as something England always had room for, a young woman with visions. In the early 1530s, she became famous for prophetic trances that drew crowds, clergy, and attention from powerful patrons. Contemporary accounts describe her predicting doom if Henry divorced Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn, exactly the kind of message a nervous regime cannot allow to go viral. At first, the crown tried the softer tools, discrediting, pressure, and attempts to bring her into line. But Barton's prophecies weren't just religious theatre anymore. They were political friction, and Henry's court, increasingly allergic to dissent, treated her like an infection. The pivot came when her supporters included respectable clergy and gentry. Now it wasn't just a woman with visions, it was a network. Official proceedings moved to break that network, and Barton was accused of treason. Because in Tudor logic, predicting the king's downfall could be framed as helping it happen. In 1534, she was executed at Tyburn, with several associates. It was a message written in the largest available font. Spiritual authority that threatened Henry's marital agenda would be treated as rebellion. Compared to Wolsey's private collapse, Barton's death was staged as public disinfectant, And speaking of staged examples, Henry's next target wasn't a prophet. He was a nobleman whose bloodline itself felt like an insult. Rank 23, Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, carried a dangerous asset in Henry VIII's England: royal ancestry. He was a Plantagenet descendant, which meant he possessed the one thing Henry could never fully control: alternative legitimacy. You could be loyal, you could be quiet, but if your family tree made you look like a spare king, you lived under a permanent shadow. By 1521, Buckingham was arrested and charged with treason. The evidence, as presented, leaned heavily on reported words, claims that he had spoken about the king's death or his own possible claim. Historical records and later analysis suggest this was the kind of Tudor case where rumour and politics held hands so tightly you couldn't tell which was leading. The pivot was the usefulness of fear. Removing Buckingham did two things at once. It destroyed a potential rival, and it reminded every other noble that status could be rewritten overnight. Buckingham was tried by peers and executed in 1521. If Henry hated Buckingham personally, it's hard to prove feelings. But the action is clear. Henry did not merely distrust him, he erased him. Lands were forfeited, the Stafford power base was dismantled, and the lesson spread quickly through aristocratic bones. Your blood could be evidence. And speaking of evidence built from fear, the next name shows Henry turning suspicion into a technique, one that would become practically a habit. Rank 22, Sir Nicholas Carew. Nicholas Carew was not some distant lord. He was a court insider, master of the horse, a man close enough to Henry to share the daily rhythms of kingship. That closeness is exactly what makes his fall feel like a personal turn rather than a purely political calculation. Carew was arrested in 1539 and executed for treason. The accusations connected him to supposed conspiracy and disloyal talk. Again, on the Tudor style of case where someone said you said could become the state says you meant. What makes it sting is that Carew had a long record of service and seemed woven into the king's early reign. So why did Henry sour? Part of the answer sits in the atmosphere of 1539, paranoia, international tension, and the tightening grip of Thomas Cromwell's government. When the crown wanted a purge, it often started with people who had enough prestige to make the purge feel real. But there's also the intimate cruelty of Henry's court. Favour was personal, access was personal, and the withdrawal of favour was often framed like moral failure. Your own fault, your own disgrace. Carew's execution read like a deliberate severing of an old relationship, turned into a public denial. Compared with Buckingham, who was dangerous by birth, Carew was dangerous by proximity. If you could cut down a man that close, everyone else learned the same lesson. Being near the king did not protect you. It simply gave Henry a better view when he decided to strike. And speaking of strikes, the next man didn't just lose his head figuratively. He lost it as part of a crackdown that showed Henry's hatred could be aimed not only at individuals, but at entire movements. Rank 21, Robert Usk. Robert Usk became the face of one of the most serious challenges to Henry's religious revolution, the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. This wasn't a tiny riot. It was mass mobilization in northern England, fueled by anger at the dissolution of monasteries, economic anxiety, and a sense that the country was being reshaped without consent. Usk was a lawyer, educated, articulate, and unusually capable of organizing crowds into something like a political message. That competence mattered. Henry could dismiss a mob as chaos, but a movement with structure feels like an alternative government. And nothing triggers a monarch's rage faster than the smell of replacement. At first, the crown played for time. Promises were made, negotiations offered. The pivot came when the movement lost leverage and the state regained control. Henry's response was not merely punitive, it was cleansing. Official records show widespread executions, leaders were pursued. And Usk, despite earlier negotiations that had implied safety, was arrested and executed in 1537. This is one of the clearest examples of Henry's style of hatred, the hatred of defiance. Not the kind you argue with, but the kind you erase so thoroughly that memory itself gets nervous. Compared to Carew, whose fall was courtly and quiet, Asker's death was a warning meant for entire regions. And speaking of regions and belief, the next targets show Henry taking aim at something even more stubborn than rebellion: conscience. Rank 20. Bishop John Fisher. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, was widely respected in his time for scholarship and piety. He was also stubborn in the specific way Henry could not tolerate. He treated the king's wishes as negotiable, and he treated his conscience as non-negotiable. Fisher refused to accept Henry as supreme head of the Church of England in the way the king demanded, and he defended Catherine of Aragon's marriage legitimacy. In other words, Fisher wasn't just disagreeing with a policy, he was undermining the emotional and dynastic core of Henry's project. The pivot came when refusal itself became treason. Under the new legal framework, not swearing an oath could be turned into an act against the state. Fisher was imprisoned in the Tower and in 1535 executed. What intensified Henry's animus was the international spotlight. Fisher was made a cardinal by the Pope while imprisoned, an act that, in Henry's eyes, looked like foreign endorsement of resistance. Contemporary accounts suggest Henry reacted with fury, interpreting it as Rome trying to crown an enemy inside his own walls. Compared with Aske, who threatened order, Fisher threatened legitimacy. A rebellion can be crushed. A respected bishop saying no in the language of morality is harder to silence because it lingers. So Henry silenced him the Tudor way, with a legal verdict and a scaffold. And speaking of lingering resistance, the next man's refusal was quieter, almost polite, but it drove Henry to a decision that echoed for centuries. Rank 19, Sir Thomas More. Thomas More is often remembered as the witty humanist, the author, the saint, the man who could turn a phrase like a dagger wrapped in velvet. But for Henry VIII, More became something more dangerous than an enemy shouting in the street. He became an enemy who would not perform. More had served as Lord Chancellor, one of the highest offices in the realm, and he was once close enough to Henry to share long conversations. But when the king demanded public endorsement of his supremacy over the church and the legitimacy of his new marriage, More tried a strategy that was both brilliant and, to Henry, infuriating. Silent. More refused to swear what he could not swear, but he also refused to loudly campaign against Henry. He attempted to let his conscience exist without becoming a spectacle. Unfortunately for him, Henry's state required spectacle. It required compliance that could be seen, repeated, and used as social pressure. The pivot came in 1535, when More was tried and executed for treason. The case leaned on testimony and interpretation, what his silence supposedly meant, what his private words supposedly implied. Official records confirm the outcome. Later debate circles the reliability of some witnesses. But the crucial point is what Henry achieved. He turned private conscience into a public crime. Compared to Fisher, whose resistance was openly theological, More's resistance was personal dignity, and Henry could have let him retire. Instead, Henry insisted on a performance of surrender, and when he didn't get it, he made an example. We're not even in the top half yet, and the pattern is already visible. Henry's worst grudges weren't always about violence or treason. They were about control over words, titles, marriages, and meaning itself. And speaking of control, the next name pulls us back into the court's most toxic weather system, the whirlwind of family, intimacy, and humiliation that turned a queen into a target. Rank 18, Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves is one of the strangest candidates for a hatred list, because Henry didn't destroy her the way he destroyed so many others. But that's exactly why she belongs here. She shows a different flavor of Henry's contempt, the kind that doesn't need blood to be cruel. Anne was married to Henry in January 1540, largely for diplomatic reasons. She was a political match meant to strengthen Protestant alliances in a tense European landscape. When Henry met her, something went wrong. Later accounts claim he felt disappointed, even deceived. The famous insults that circulated afterward may be exaggerated or filtered through hostile courtiers, but official behavior tells its own story. Henry wanted out immediately. The pivot was embarrassment. Henry could tolerate many things, but not the feeling that someone else had staged his life like a joke. If the marriage made him look foolish, someone had to pay. And because Henry could not easily admit he had misjudged the match, he framed the problem as Anne's unsuitability, her lack of true consent, the technicalities of her prior betrothal, the idea that the marriage had never been properly valid. Anne was pressured into compliance. The marriage was annulled in July 1540, and while she survived, remarkably, she even received generous settlement and was treated as the king's sister. The emotional temperature of the situation matters. Henry did not just end a marriage, he erased it as an error. Compared to More, who refused to perform, Anne of Cleves performed exactly what Henry needed. Agreement. That likely saved her life. But the contempt still radiated outward, and the people who arranged the marriage learned the hard way that Henry's humiliation could turn into lethal blame. And speaking of blame, the next section is where that humiliation becomes a method, and where Henry's hatred starts to spread beyond individuals into something like a doctrine. But pattern break. How Henry turned dislike into state power. By the time Henry VIII reaches the middle of his reign, personal opinion isn't just a mood anymore. It becomes policy. A normal, powerful man dislikes someone and stops inviting them to dinner. Henry dislikes someone and the law quietly reshapes itself to make that dislike actionable. Words become weapons. Silence becomes evidence. Family trees become suspicious objects. And once the machine starts moving, it doesn't just hit the target, it hits everyone standing behind them. That's why this ranking matters. It isn't a list of petty arguments. It's a map of what happened when one person's ego fused with the authority of the crown. Sometimes Henry hated people who blocked him. Sometimes he hated people who embarrassed him. And sometimes he hated people who reminded him that he could be wrong. But the consistent pattern is this. Henry rarely settled for gone. He wanted unmade, titles stripped, reputations dismantled, allies frightened into denial. Even after death, he often pushed for official narratives that justified what he'd done, because for Henry, being feared wasn't enough. He needed to be right. Now we move higher up the list, where the consequences get sharper, the pursuits get longer, and the king's anger starts to look less like reaction and more like appetite. Rank 17. Thomas Cromwell. For a few crucial years, Thomas Cromwell was the engine of Henry's revolution. He helped drive the break with Rome, reorganized government, expanded royal authority, and pushed the dissolution of monasteries with an efficiency that felt almost modern. Contemporary accounts describe him as relentless, someone who could turn Henry's desires into paperwork that reshaped a nation, which makes his fall feel like one of the clearest examples of Henry's emotional volatility meeting political convenience. By 1540, Cromwell had enemies everywhere, and then came the Anne of Cleves marriage. Whether Cromwell deserved the blame is beside the point. Henry felt humiliated, and humiliation was the quickest route to hatred. Official records show Cromwell was arrested suddenly, without the slow cooling-off period you'd expect for a man of his power. He was condemned by attainder, a legal shortcut that turned accusation into verdict without a normal trial. The pivot is the speed. Henry didn't merely remove a minister, he amputated him. Cromwell was executed in July 1540, and the comparative pattern is brutal. Anne of Cleves lived because she agreed to vanish politely. Cromwell died because Henry needed someone to carry the shame out of the room. And speaking of men blamed for Henry's private feelings, the next name is someone Henry couldn't execute, so he tried to crush him another way. Rank 16. Pope Clement VII. If you want to understand Henry's long-term grudges, look at the people who told him no, not insultingly, not dramatically, just no, in a way that implied the king was not the center of the universe. Pope Clement VII became that figure during the divorce crisis. Henry wanted an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. Clement hesitated, delayed, and ultimately refused to grant what Henry demanded, partly because the politics were poisonous, so partly because Catherine's nephew was the most powerful ruler in Europe. For Henry, that refusal wasn't bureaucracy, it was defiance, and the pivot is that Henry responded by changing the rules of reality inside England. Parliamentary acts and official declarations gradually severed the kingdom's legal obedience to Rome. Monastic wealth was redirected, oaths were required, refusal became treason. Clement VII couldn't be dragged to the Tower, but Henry attacked the Pope's authority where it hurt, by stripping it out of English life and replacing it with himself. Comparatively, Clement's punishment wasn't a scaffold. It was the creation of a new religious order with Henry at the top. That's hatred on the scale of architecture. If one man won't give you what you want, you don't just get revenge. Like you redesign the building so he can never block you again. And speaking of the power that helped Clement resist Henry, the next entry is the ruler whose shadow made the divorce crisis so dangerous. Rank 15, Emperor Charles V. Charles V didn't need to declare himself Henry's enemy to become one. He simply had to exist as the Holy Roman Emperor, as the dominant power on the continent, and as the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. From Henry's perspective, Charles represented a humiliating constraint. Henry wanted a marriage annulled and a new dynastic start. Charles represented the political price of offending Catherine's family. Even when Charles was busy with wars and far-flung imperial crises, his presence sat in the background of every papal decision like a weight. The pivot is that Henry's anger wasn't only at a man, but at the feeling of being cornered. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence describes a tense dance of alliances, threats, and shifting promises. Henry's government made England look bold, but it was operating in a world where Charles could, in practice, make the papacy cautious and make potential allies hesitate. Henry's responses were indirect but telling. He escalated the break with Rome, leaned into propaganda about sovereignty, and punished domestic figures connected to Catherine's cause, actions that read as retaliation against the wider imperial pressure he couldn't personally strike. Comparatively, Charles was too powerful to destroy, so Henry redirected the hatred into symbolic victories at home. When a king can't punish the obstacle, he punishes the people who remind him the obstacle is there. And speaking of reminders Henry couldn't tolerate, the next person haunted him not with an army, but with the stubborn fact of a marriage he wanted the world to forget. Rank 14, Catherine of Aragon. Henry's relationship with Catherine of Aragon didn't begin in hatred. It began in partnership, respect, and public stability. She served as queen for decades, acted as regent while Henry campaigned abroad, and was admired for intelligence and dignity. But when the male heir didn't arrive, and when Henry fixated on Anne Boleyn, Catherine became, in his mind, the embodiment of delay. The pivot is the moment Henry stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a problem with a face. Official actions show a slow, tightening cruelty. Catherine was separated from her daughter Mary, and she was pushed into smaller households and moved away from court. She was pressured to accept the annulment narrative and to acknowledge herself as no longer queen. She refused, consistently, insisting she was Henry's lawful wife. What's revealing is how long Henry kept punishing her after the marriage effectively ended in practice, even when he had Anne, even when he had the machinery of supremacy. Catherine's refusal remained a thorn because it challenged the story Henry needed everyone to repeat. Comparatively, Catherine wasn't executed, but her punishment was prolonged, isolating and deeply personal, designed to break identity rather than body. She died in January 1536, still maintaining her position, and Henry's court treated that steadfastness as insolence to the end. And speaking of what happened right after Catherine's death, And the next entry is where Henry's anger turns from slow pressure to sudden annihilation. Rank 13. Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was not just Henry's wife, she was the hinge of his revolution, the person for whom he risked international scandal, religious rupture, and a complete remapping of legitimacy. That intensity is exactly why her fall reads like hatred, not merely political necessity. By 1536, Anne had not produced the surviving son Henry wanted. Court factions were sharpening knives, and Henry's attention shifted. Contemporary accounts suggest his feelings cooled fast, as if the love had been spent and only irritation remained. Then came the pivot, the charges. Anne was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, allegations that many historians consider dubious or politically engineered, and though the official record treated them as settled fact. The point isn't that Henry believed every detail. The point is that Henry allowed the most extreme narrative possible to become the public explanation for his own reversal. Anne was tried and executed in May 1536. Comparatively, this wasn't just a queen removed. This was a queen transformed into a criminal in order to protect Henry's ego and future plans. If he had simply annulled the marriage, it would have suggested he made a catastrophic choice. If she was a traitor, then Henry was a victim of deception, cleaner, safer, and more flattering to the king. And speaking of traitor narratives used to tidy up Henry's private disasters, the next entry is a queen whose downfall was staged almost like a morality play, except the moral was obedience. A rank 12, Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard was young, glamorous, and initially treated like a fresh start. Henry married her in 1540, shortly after escaping the humiliation of Anne of Cleves. For a while, Catherine functioned as proof that Henry was still desirable, still virile, still the centre of courtly gravity. Then the past caught up, along with rumours, testimonies, and an investigation that quickly became impossible to stop. The pivot is how fast affection turned into punishment. Once Catherine was framed as unchaste before marriage and unfaithful after, the issue wasn't only betrayal, it was humiliation. Again, Henry's public image depended on being the chooser, the judge of virtue, the man whose household was ordered. A queen's scandal made him look foolish, and Henry did not tolerate looking foolish. Official proceedings gathered confessions and statements from people around Catherine. Her alleged lover, Thomas Culpeper, was executed. Frances Derham, tied to her earlier life, was executed with particular brutality. Catherine herself was arrested, condemned, and executed in February 1542. Comparatively, Anne Boleyn's fall was political and factional. Catherine Howard's fall was also personal theatre, sex, shame, and a king trying to punish the idea that he had been tricked in public twice. The deeper the embarrassment, the harsher the need for a violent conclusion. And speaking of violent conclusions, the next ranks move into Henry's most obsessive category of hatred, the people whose very existence threatened his control over the future. Rank 11, Mary Tudor, Princess Mary. If Henry's hatred had a long, slow-burning form, it often looked like what he did to his own daughter. Mary Tudor, later Queen Mary I, wasn't a rival army or a scheming minister. She was a living reminder that Henry's first marriage had once been legitimate, publicly honoured, and blessed by Europe. And when Henry tore that marriage apart in the early 1530s, Mary became a problem he couldn't solve with a treaty. After the marriage to Catherine of Aragon was overturned in 1533, official policy shifted quickly. Mary was declared illegitimate, pushed out of the line of succession, and forced into a humiliating new status. Contemporary accounts describe her household being broken up, her access to her mother restricted, and her position at court reduced, at points, into a role that made her serve the new order rather than embody it. The pivot came when Henry demanded performance, not just compliance. Mary was pressured to acknowledge the king's supremacy and to accept the invalidity of her parents' marriage. For years, she resisted. The state answered with pressure that wasn't theatrical, just constant. Threats, isolation, and the steady implication that refusal could become criminal. Compared to many on this list, Mary survived. But survival doesn't cancel the fact that Henry spent years trying to crush her identity into a signature. And speaking of signatures, the next man's refusal to endorse Henry's great matter didn't just make him unwelcome, it made him hunted. Rank 10, Reginald Pole. Reginald Pole had the sort of resume that should have kept him safe. Noble blood, high education, and early royal favour. He also had the sort of conscience Henry VIII considered a direct threat, the kind that could sound calm while saying no. Pole opposed Henry's break with Rome and the annulment from Catherine of Aragon, and he did it in a way that cut deeper than rebellion. Rebellion is noisy, you can punish it. Pole's criticism was intellectual and moral, designed to make Henry look illegitimate in the eyes of educated Europe. By the mid-1530s, Pole was outside England, and the relationship curdled into something unmistakably personal. Official records indicate Henry's government moved against Pole through law, attainders that branded him a traitor, and, through blood. Pole's family became collateral. Men connected to him were investigated, arrested, and in multiple cases executed. And as if the king couldn't reach Pole himself and settled for the nearest living tissue, the pivot is duration. Henry's anger at many people flared and passed. With Pole it persisted, year after year, because Pole symbolized the one thing Henry couldn't dominate with brute force, a respected voice saying the king had crossed a line. Compared to Mary's coercion, Pole's punishment spread outward into a family purge, a kind of proxy war fought on English soil. And speaking of family purges, the next person shows Henry's cruelty at its most chilling, punishing an elderly woman for the crime of being related to the wrong man. Rank 9, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Margaret Pole was Plantagenet royalty by blood, a high-status noblewoman, and, most dangerously in Henry's eyes, the mother of Reginald Pole. In a stable kingdom, that combination might have meant honour. In Henry's England, it meant suspicion that could be activated whenever convenient. By 1538, the atmosphere around the court was thick with fear of conspiracy, especially anything that smelled like a Catholic alternative to Henry's supremacy. Margaret was arrested and held in the Tower of London for years. Official proceedings tied her to alleged plots connected to her family and wider resistance. Some elements, like reported discovery of incriminating symbols or items, are disputed in later retellings, and the precise evidentiary weight is debated. But what is not debated is outcome. The Crown treated her as guilty, useful, and expendable. The pivot is what her execution represented. In 1541, Margaret Pole, an older woman by then, was put to death. Our contemporary accounts describe the event as grim and chaotic, and later narratives emphasize its brutality, though exact details vary by source tradition. Either way, the message was unmistakable. Henry's government wasn't just punishing actions, it was punishing lineage. Compared to Reginald Pole, who could argue from abroad, Margaret was physically present, an accessible target. Henry's hatred didn't need to prove her guilt beyond doubt. It needed to prove the king could reach anyone. And speaking of reach, the next man is another example of Henry severing a royal bloodline that felt to him like an insult simply by existing. Rank 8, Henry Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter. Henry Courtenay wasn't merely a noble, and he was a cousin of the king with Yorkist blood, exactly the sort of person who could become a magnet for discontent whether he wanted the role or not. In the 1530s, that was enough to make a man dangerous. Courtenay had once enjoyed royal favour and high status, but as Henry's religious reforms and succession politics intensified, the court's paranoia sharpened. By 1538, Courtenay was arrested and accused of involvement in what later became known as the Exeter Conspiracy, a cluster of allegations that connected noble discontent, possible foreign support, and resistance to Henry's supremacy. The pivot here is how Tudor justice could become preemptive. You didn't have to raise a banner to be treated like you were about to. Words, associations, and bloodline could be framed as intention. Official records show Courtenay was condemned and executed in late 1538, and his fall helped strip away another branch of potential dynastic competition. Comparatively, Buckingham's execution in 1521 was an early warning about royal blood. Courtenay's death in 1538 was part of a broader strategy, Henry clearing the chessboard so thoroughly that no alternative piece could even be imagined. And speaking of clearing the board, the next entry is a man Henry used repeatedly, until the day Henry decided useful and trustworthy were no longer the same thing. Rank 7. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, is a complicated case, which is exactly why he belongs in the upper half of this list. Henry didn't hate Norfolk in the simple way he hated a dissenter. He hated him in the way a volatile ruler hates an ally who starts to look like a liability. Norfolk was one of England's premier nobles and a key figure in Henry's court politics. He also sat near the centre of the Boleyn H. Howard web. Anne Boleyn was his niece. Catherine Howard was also connected to his family network. That means Norfolk's fortunes rose and fell with women whose fates hinged on Henry's mood. When Anne Boleyn fell in 1536, Norfolk survived. When Catherine Howard fell in 1542, Norfolk survived again, but not without damage, suspicion, and the sense that the Howard name carried scandal like smoke. The pivot came late in Henry's reign. By 1546, factional warfare at court had turned vicious, and Norfolk's son, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was accused of treason. Surrey was executed in January 1547. Norfolk himself was arrested, condemned, and set for execution as well. Then Henry died. Compared to those Henry executed cleanly and quickly, Norfolk's story shows a different edge. The king's readiness to devour even the oldest aristocratic pillars once they stopped feeling safe. Norfolk didn't die by Henry's hand only because time ran out. And speaking of time running out, the next person didn't get the mercy of a ticking clock, only the full force of Henry's dissolution machine, aimed like a spear at the last stubborn strongholds of the Old England. Rank 6. Richard Whiting, Abbot of Glastonbury. Richard Whiting, Abbot of Glastonbury, wasn't famous for plotting a coup. He was famous for presiding over one of the wealthiest and most symbolically powerful monasteries in England, an institution that represented everything Henry's new order wanted to dismantle. By the late 1530s, the dissolution of the monasteries had become both a financial project and a political purge. Monastic houses held land, wealth, and a kind of spiritual independence that clashed with Henry's supremacy. Many surrendered. The ones that resisted became examples. In 1539, Whiting was arrested, accused of treason, and condemned. Official records show the crown moved swiftly to seize monastic assets. The pivot is the choice of punishment. Whiting was not simply removed from office. He was executed in a manner designed to terrify, hanged, drawn, and quartered, then displayed as a warning. The location mattered too. The execution's staging and aftermath were meant to be read by anyone who still believed the old religious institutions could stand as powers unto themselves. Compared to nobles like Norfolk, who could sometimes survive by playing court games, Whiting represented a different kind of threat, a public institution with deep roots. Henry's response wasn't just hatred of a man. It was hatred of a system that refused to kneel quickly enough. And speaking of systems Henry couldn't tolerate, the next ranks moved from religious institutions to the people Henry treated as personal humiliations, men whose actions made the king feel mocked and therefore made them dangerously close to unforgettable. Rank 5. Francis Derham. Francis Derham didn't become one of Henry VIII's most loathed enemies because he led a rebellion or challenged the throne. He became loathed because he was a walking receipt, proof that Henry's fifth marriage might have been built on a lie Henry didn't detect. Derham had been connected to Catherine Howard before she became queen. In the messy, informal way relationships could form in noble households. When Catherine's past began unraveling in 1541, Derham was pulled into the investigation and questioned until the story became unavoidable. The Queen had a before, and that before wasn't vague. It had names, it had places, it had witnesses. The pivot is how Henry's personal humiliation turned into legal savagery. Once Henry believed he'd been publicly mocked, married to a woman whose sexual history made him look foolish. He needed the punishment to feel proportionate to the embarrassment. Official proceedings framed Derham not merely as immoral, but as implicated in a kind of betrayal of the crown's dignity. Derham was executed with extreme brutality, and in the calculus of this ranking, that brutality matters. Henry didn't just want Derham dead. He wanted the story around Derham to become terrifying enough that nobody would ever dare bring him a humiliating truth again. And speaking of humiliating truths, the next man wasn't just a witness to Catherine Howard's past. He was accused of being her present. Rank 4. Thomas Culpeper. Thomas Culpeper's name lands so high on this list because his alleged role wasn't simply scandalous. It was existentially insulting to Henry VIII's self-image. Culpeper was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, meaning he lived in the king's orbit, the intimate space where access itself was a kind of currency. When Catherine Howard was investigated, Culpeper was accused of having a sexual relationship with the Queen. Whether every detail of the case reflects truth or courtroom necessity is still debated in historical interpretation, but the official record was clear about the Crown's conclusion. This was treason. The pivot is the Tudor logic that made sex political. A queen's body wasn't her private life. It was dynastic infrastructure. If the queen could produce a child, that child could reshape succession. So an alleged affair wasn't cheating. It was an attack on the future, an attempt, as the law framed it, to plant doubt at the heart of the monarchy. Culpeper was executed in 1541. But what pushes him above Derham is the personal sting. Derham made Henry look naive about the past. Culpeper made Henry look powerless in the present, cuckolded not in rumour, but in the king's own household. And if you think that kind of insult is where Henry's anger peaked, the next entry shows something even worse in Henry's eyes. A nobleman who behaved as if royal bloodlines could be redesigned without Henry's permission. Rank 3. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, wasn't executed because he was a nobody who crossed a line. He was executed because he was an elite who acted like he owned the line. Surrey was a brilliant, arrogant aristocrat, poet, soldier and heir to the powerful Duke of Norfolk. He also carried the Howard confidence like a weapon, and in Henry's final years that confidence became dangerous. The official case against him centred on treasonous intent, including the use of royal arms and suggestions that he was positioning himself too close to succession power. And the pivot is the timing. By the mid-1540s, Henry was ageing, increasingly unwell, and intensely focused on the stability of the Tudor line through Prince Edward. Anything that hinted at a rival power block, especially one tied to old, noble blood, looked like a future coup waiting to happen. Surrey was arrested, tried and executed in January 1547, days before Henry himself died. In ranked terms, Surrey climbs this high because of what the crown was really punishing. Not a single act, but a posture. Surrey embodied the old aristocratic belief that pedigree could stand beside the monarchy rather than under it. Henry's response was to cut him down at the moment it would most terrify everyone else, right at the edge of a royal succession. And speaking of terrifying everyone else, the next entry is about a man Henry treated as so stubbornly unfixable that the king tried to break not just his body, but the example his life represented. Rank 2. John Houghton, Prior of the London Charterhouse. John Houghton rises this high because Henry's war with conscience reached its purest, most ruthless form in the Carthusian resistance. Houghton was the prior of the London Charterhouse, leader of a monastic community known for discipline, silence, and a refusal to treat faith as a political accessory. When Henry demanded oaths acknowledging his supremacy over the church, the Carthusians' resistance wasn't theatrical. It was calm. It was consistent. It was, in Henry's world, intolerable. The pivot is that Henry's regime didn't just want compliance, it needed respected people to model compliance. And Houghton modelled the opposite, a man willing to die rather than say words he believed were false. That kind of refusal spreads without armies, it spreads through admiration. Houghton was executed in 1535, and the campaign against his order continued. Imprisonment, starvation, and further deaths for other Carthusians who would not bend. The king's hatred here isn't speculative, it's visible in the sustained effort to crush a tiny community whose only real weapon was integrity. Compared to Surrey, who threatened dynastic politics, Houghton threatened the emotional legitimacy of the new order. Because if one quiet monk could say no and die cleanly, what did that say about the king's moral authority? And that brings us to number 1, the most chilling case because Henry's target wasn't even alive to resist him. Rank 1, Thomas Becket. Thomas Becket had been dead for centuries when Henry VIII decided to destroy him. That's why he's number 1. Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, had become England's most famous symbol of church resistance to royal power after his murder in 1170. Over time, his shrine at Canterbury turned into a spiritual landmark, drawing pilgrims, money, and, most importantly, an idea that a king could be wrong and a churchman could stand against him and become holy for it. Henry VIII could tolerate many things, but he could not tolerate a national cult built around the concept that defying royal authority might be righteous. The pivot came in the late 1530s during the wider campaign against shrines and monasteries. Official actions treated Becket's cult as if it were a present-day threat, not a medieval memory. His shrine was dismantled, his relics and treasures were seized, his name was targeted in proclamations and institutional practice, an effort to erase him not just physically, but narratively. This is hatred at its most revealing. Henry didn't punish Becket for something Becket did to Henry. He punished Becket for what Becket represented. The possibility that kings answer to something beyond themselves, and when a monarch goes after an idea hard enough to put a dead saint on trial in the court of power, you're no longer watching politics, you're watching obsession. So what do these 25 names really show? Beyond the obvious blood and drama, they show that Henry VIII's hatreds weren't random, they clustered around a few recurring wounds. The first was contradiction. Anyone who calmly told him no, whether it was a pope, or a bishop, a scholar, or a silent daughter who wouldn't sign away her identity. The second was humiliation. Anyone who made him feel foolish, especially in public, especially in marriage, especially in that sacred theatre where kings performed strength and certainty for an entire nation. And the third was succession. Anyone whose bloodline, influence, or symbolism threatened his control of the future. And notice something else. Henry's anger rarely stopped at the person in front of him. It spread. It hit families, it hit households, it hit institutions, it hit entire regions. When Henry wanted someone gone, he often wanted the memory of their resistance to feel unsafe. That's why the punishments are so often designed not just to kill, but to teach. But the most unsettling pattern is the way Henry's hatred fused with legality. He didn't just lash out. He built frameworks that made his feelings enforceable. Oaths, attainders, treason statutes, confessions extracted under pressure, tools that turned private resentment into public reality. That is the true Tudor horror. Not just that Henry could hate you, but that his hatred could become paperwork, and the paperwork could become your fate. And if you're wondering why this still matters, it's because Henry's reign didn't end with his last breath. The church he remade, the wealth he redistributed, the precedents he set for punishing dissent, those ripples outlived him. Even the people who survived his anger lived inside the world his grudges built. So the next time Henry VIII is reduced to a caricature, 6 wives, big banquets, bigger tantrums, remember the evidence left behind. Hatred in his hands wasn't a mood, and it was governance. And somewhere in the silence after the scaffolds, you can still hear the question his victims were forced to answer. What happens when one person's ego becomes the law?